Okay.
So you know. So now no bad words, okay? So hello, Ambassador Rhodes. I'm so happy you decided to join and speak with me. I'm sort of starting this YouTube channel thing called Outer Limits. I just want to start talking to people who are thought leaders, and you are one of them on our campus at Cal State Dominguez Hills in the Negotiation Conflict Resolution Program. And I decided to start with you because I have been asked to guest edit an issue of the Alternative Dispute Resolution Journal on coaching. We wanted that Dr. Brian Jarrett's obviously was the previous editor-in-chief, and we talked about acknowledging your work over your career, your support of our students on campus. And we felt that, you know, it would be good to acknowledge you and your work and how it relates to today, your work, especially on the passing of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, national holiday. And so it's good for me because I like listening. When I listen to your stories, like you're a very good storyteller, and I learn, and I feel like I could write a better acknowledgement just by listening to the story rather than just getting data points and then trying to, you know, write it out from there. So I just want to first ask you about how long you've been at Dominguez Hills. What do you teach and what your specializations are?
Well, before I even get into that, I want to thank you for the help, instruction, and advice that you gave me since I'm new to teaching. I started at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and I never taught before. You know, I trained people in the investment banking business and run businesses and stuff, but teaching students was a new experience. And when you were in charge of the Faculty Development Center, I can't thank you enough for all the time that you took with me. And it helped to make me, I think, a better instructor and lecturer. And that credit goes to you. So,
Ambassador Rhodes, that is just a very kind thing to say. And it was my pleasure to support faculty to do their jobs properly. Teaching is not an easy thing to get into. You know, you're changing careers, and especially at, you know, our institution. It's a, you know, traditional public university. It's got its bureaucracy that can be super difficult to navigate. It is difficult to navigate. So it was my pleasure to help you and get support that you need to serve the students and the mission of the university.
Well, I just want you to know that it made a real difference.
Okay,
and
thank you.
What it also did was it created a feeling or a notion within me that has caused me to change and hopefully improve the classes that I've been teaching over the last 4 years.
Okay.
So what I teach are a few things. One is Introduction to Negotiation. I'm teaching another class so I'm teaching that this fall, as well as Conflict Resolution and Peace Building. In the spring of the year, I usually teach international conflicts, and as well, that's actually in the summer. And in the spring, I teach a leadership class. So essentially 4 classes that I teach year round.
Well, so can you tell me a little bit about your experience working with the students?
Sure. You know, one of the things that I try to do is, first off, make the class interesting. I was a student myself, and the last thing I want to see is a student falling asleep on me. So what I try to do is engage my students in all my classes. even the classes that are online and are asynchronous.
Mhm.
What I do with the students is I try to get them to think. I'm not interested in people being able to parrot back to me things that I say. I try to ask open-ended questions, and I want them to think about those answers. But I also want them to do it in a scholarly fashion. So it's not just good enough to give me your opinion. I
Mhm.
need you to give me your opinion and what supports that opinion. I think what we really want our students to be is educated. And by that, what I mean is too often in higher education, uh, professors try to propagandize students and give them their opinion. Uh, I'm not interested in my students having my opinion. What I want them to be able to do is just understand the various sides of an issue. So um, if they understand the pros and the cons of any given issue, and they understand who's supporting the pros and the cons on each issue, then they can make a value decision that makes sense to them and it's well founded. That's my goal. That's what I
Mhm.
see as my
Mhm.
mission.
Yeah, that's really important, Ambassador Rhodes, even though I call you Steve. That's, I mean, if we, in some cases, we've been starting to lose that in the university system, that idea of being able to see multiple perspectives of a problem, and especially in the area, the field that you're teaching in, you have to be able to do that, because if you can't, there's no there is no resolution, right? You can't even take any steps towards it. And so, I really think that we're living in this state of emergency right now, like what Walter Benjamin talked about in the 30s and the lead up towards fascism in Europe, right? We're in a state of emergency where people are so sort of terrorized constantly into a feeling of having to be safe all the time, right? So on multiple levels. And, you can see this, what's happened in the university with, the discourse around safe spaces means that, a lot of times people start to feel, and students start to feel this, like everything and everyone is a threat to them. And that's, or ideas or things that are said are a threat. And so it's created this sort of polarization that I find. I mean, my classes haven't been, I wasn't teaching for a few years. I taught last semester for the first time in a while. And my classes have been pretty good. I think that my strategy aligns a lot with yours, but people need to start looking at being able to handle different ideas than, differences of thought and opinion. I mean, that's what college was supposed to be about. And it was when I was in college. It was starting to change, but when I was in college, it was. And so it's, if you're going to people are going to spend money, a lot of money on an education, you think you should be building these skills. So, I think we need to start talking more about that in open spaces. So,
I can't agree with you more. The one thing that we seem to have lost in the last several years is a certain civility.
mhm.
There are over 7.2 billion plus people on the face of the earth. And God made us all different.
Mhm.
So for anyone to feel that someone is nuts or the village idiot because they don't agree with us,
Mhm.
that isn't particularly well founded. So what I try to do with the students that I teach is get them to appreciate the fact that there are always going to be differences. Uh, and what I stress with my students in every class is to listen. And we don't teach that very well in most instances, starting from kindergarten through postgraduate. But listening is really the key to arriving at a compromise or negotiated agreement. Too often what I see and what I've seen in politics is people they begin a discussion with a preconceived notion of what the other person is going to say, and it becomes a debate as opposed to listening to try to figure out how can we meet in the middle. And I think that's what I try to get my students to focus on. If you spend less time trying to come up with a counter to what someone else says, you can actually listen to what they say, and the solution usually is right in front of you.
Listening is a skill, and everybody can get better at it. And, when you're thinking about how you're going to kill the other person's argument in your head while the other person's speaking, you're not listening. Correct. And, it's a very egoic, defensive way of operating in the world. And it really goes against, the humanistic aspect of education that we're supposed to, be promoting, or we're promoting, and now we're promoting something else. And I'm not entirely sure what that is. But I think that, with that being said, I think another important aspect of your presence on campus is that you have this experience in public service, and you open up the possibilities for students of like how they can, look at their career and the different possibilities that are out there. And, public service and its many manifestations is one area that, still is viable. And there's lots of opportunities for students, and they can know about them. But also, apart from the skill of listening, which this is a part of also, is that you also have an expertise, at least on a real personal as well as a professional level, of networking, which is also a skill, right? That's very important to build networks. If you're learning how to shut other people down in a meeting or cancel them or, create some kind of, make an enemy out of them, that's the opposite of networking. And networking, which people think I'm really social because I'm a pretty good speaker, but I'm actually pretty shy when it comes to networking. And it is something that I wish I would have learned early on. So can you talk about the importance of networking and building relationships?
Certainly. But let me begin with something that you talked about in terms of listening. A professor of mine from Harvard, a woman named Dana Curtis, she's been a mediator since 1977. She teaches at Harvard. She's taught at Stanford, Santa Clara, and she works full-time as a mediator. She's written a paper, an article that I use in many of my classes, and it deals with empathy. Empathy. And the way she describes empathy is different from what a lot of people believe empathy is. Her description is being able to listen to the other person, someone else, and be able to paraphrase what they say to you in your own words, so that they understand that you heard them. So that's where things begin. With regard to networking, my father, God rest him, used to always say that, well, two things that he used to tell me, so with great repetition, is you only get one opportunity to make a first impression. And the second thing is don't burn your bridges, because you don't know when you're going to need to go back and revisit those people. At the White House, the expression was, be careful of who you step on as you climb the ladder of success, because you will see those people again as you move down that ladder. Networking, to me, is really taking a genuine interest in people that you either work with, have an affection for, genuinely like, and work and want to be friends with. Uh, most of the successful people that I know, it's interesting that their friends are usually their business partners, or they've done business with people who are their friends. There was a city councilman here in Los Angeles many years ago. In fact, I think he was the first Black city councilman in the city of Los Angeles. His name was Gilbert Lindsay. Gil represented the downtown area of Los Angeles. And he would typically say, all things being equal, I'd rather do business with my friends. And that's something that we probably don't appreciate as much as we should. If you do business with a friend, a real friend, you are going to be honest with them, and you expect them to be honest with you and straightforward. You may not always agree, but you know that what you're going to hear from them is going to be genuine. Mm-hmm. And what I try to do with my students to make them appreciate the fact that their word should be their bond. There was a book written several years ago by Dominguez called The Four Agreements.
Mm-hmm. And I'm familiar with that book.
The first agreement is be impeccable with your word. And if you are impeccable with your word, that can change your life. Let me give you an example. Last week, I spoke to a gentleman named Alan Homer. Alan Homer is a lawyer in Washington. And when I was on the president's staff at the White House, Alan was my boss. His title was Deputy Assistant to the President. The way titles work at the White House is Assistant to the President, Deputy Assistant, and Special Assistant. And those are commissioned officers by the president. Alan was a deputy assistant, and our boss was a guy named Richard Williamson, who was assistant to the president. So Alan was responsible for the day-to-day operations of our office. I hadn't spoken to Alan since 1983. But because I'm in the process of writing an article on block grants and how we negotiated block grants, I called a mutual friend of ours to get his phone number, and we must have talked 45 minutes, and it was just like old times. Mm-hmm. Because we developed more than a working relationship. We had appreciation for each other as people, and he has agreed to be interviewed in the article that I'm planning on writing and publishing, hopefully by December of this year. The reason I tell you that story is, unfortunately, our students, in addition to learning the material that they need to learn to graduate, there are certain things that we don't teach, like being able to make people feel appreciated, and just listening to people can make them feel special. Mm-hmm. And being able to make someone feel special is a very unique and valuable asset, assuming it's genuine, of course. But those are the kinds of things you don't get in a book, mm-hmm. And those are the things that I try to impress upon my students. For instance, I try to get them to understand, look, you don't just call people when you need them. It's important sometimes just to call someone that you know and you want to be close to, and just see how they're doing. The last thing you want is people to feel that every time you call them or text them, you want something. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's not a relationship. So mm-hmm.
Very transactional. Like, yeah, we're taught to be transactional in our relationships with each other, actually, because it's efficient. It seems efficient, but it's not.
It's not.
It's not. It doesn't create. It doesn't build like you're talking the way that you're talking.
Right. And the other thing is, it's okay to have a goal, but the other agreement that I try to get my students to appreciate is always do your best. That's the fourth agreement in Dominguez's book, The Four Agreements. And the reason you always want to do your best in terms of networking and in life in general is it's like muscle memory in exercise. If you always do your best, you get in the habit of doing your best. And doing your best becomes the way you operate, whatever your best is. And we all know that's going to change from day to day. But the other part to this is, as I've told many students, and they come back and they reported to me that it was true, you never know who is observing what you do. And if people see that you're always doing your best, that leaves quite a positive impression on other folks. And it can also motivate other people to do their best. So I'm sorry if I'm rambling here, but
no. This is great. I love hearing this and I love to know. I don't know those details about. I presented in your class one time, but I don't know those kinds of details of your approach to teaching, and that's really important. So maybe this link could just go out to the NCRP students. This little interview, maybe it's going to inspire people to sign up for your classes, right? Because they don't know what they see a name. You know what I mean? It's just, I need to get this requirement taken care of. But, sometimes you get, something more. We had NCRP, an advisement for the new students. There's a great group of them, Steve, like really, really great. A few of the faculty were there. It's a very unique program. And, I can see if maybe some of them see what you're doing and they, see a little interview, your ideas come across. And then it's like, this is what you're going to get, right? So students don't get that before they sign up for something.
What's interesting is I looked at the schedule that starts next week. And in two of the classes, I'm teaching two classes, and I noticed that in one class, I have 3 students that I've had in 2 other classes. So I'm not saying that I'm building a following. I thought that was interesting to see. Coming back. Let me just tell you one quick story. There was a woman in my class. She had 2 sons. She has 2 sons, and she was in my leadership class. And this woman worked very, very hard. I don't know if I can mention her name or not because she's a star.
Well, don't mention her name because if we put it on YouTube, just.
Well, she was absolutely wonderful. She did her work. She was very thoughtful about it. Each week I assigned a writing assignment to my classes, regardless of what I'm teaching, because I want to be able to monitor people's progress. And one of the things that I've learned in both business and politics is a good leader wants to make sure you achieve your goal and you don't want people to fail. So if you're monitoring people's work weekly, for instance, in this class, you can provide a lot of positive feedback. You can tell them where they need to place emphasis and those kinds of things. So this particular student was carrying a full load. She was working, she was mother of 2, single mother. And each week in class or before class, she would want to meet with me to talk about what she missed the week before, what she should work on, and those kinds of things. And we worked on, this was my leadership class, we worked on how you prepare a resume, how to conduct yourself in an interview, And she ended up getting the A in the class because she did excellent work. But the reason I'm telling you this is because the class ended in May, and this is a couple of years ago. And in July, I received a text from her where she was telling me that for the first time in her life, she had gone out on interviews and had received job offers from 3 different companies.
Wow.
And she said it was because she used the stuff that she learned in the leadership class. And she said it actually works.
Mhm.
So the reason I'm telling you this is there is no magic to leadership, and you can teach people to be leaders. And a leader is different from a good manager. And what we try to teach is leadership. Management is essentially looking at numbers and getting the job done, but leadership adds a different dimension because the people that you're leading know that you care about them and you inspire them to do good things. And you can be a leader and not be the head of the department. Okay. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you for that. Can we switch gears a little bit? I do want to mention that it sounds like listening to what you do in your classes, and this is not going on in a lot of other classes that I know of. It's like you're actually doing some life coaching, really. Like there's a coaching element. You're like it's beyond the material. It's beyond the course material. This is like about how to build up a life, right? And be successful. And so I'm really happy to hear that, especially since this issue's on coaching. But I'd like to now segue to your career in public service briefly, and then talk about your role in the founding of Martin Luther King Jr. National Holiday. If you can go on to that.
Well, public service. I guess it started with volunteer work. When I was in school, I used to work as a volunteer at the Y. I taught swimming, coached baseball.
And where was this? Where you grew up?
I grew up in New Orleans. And New Orleans, as people say, they refer to it as the city that care forgot, meaning you come to New Orleans, you can forget all your cares. And unfortunately, a lot of people do that. But most of my life, my parents emphasized the fact that the goal in life is to do good and provide service to others. It wasn't good enough to just have a good game when I was playing baseball. So if I came back home and tell my father, hey, Dad, we won, and I did this and that, I got a hit and threw a couple of double plays, he'd say, well, how did the rest of the team do? How did you contribute to the rest of the team? So that was kind of instilled in me from early on. I spent 3 years at a seminary in high school where I thought I was going to be a priest. And I developed another level of personal reflection and a greater, deeper belief in God. So by the time I got to college, I was pretty well grounded in terms of who I was. I didn't know what I was going to be. So once again, by doing a good job, I ended up working at a company called Dart Industries. It was run by a fellow named Justin Dart. The company was the engine that drove the company initially was Rexall drugstores. But through the 60s, They'd acquired a lot of plastic and petrochemical companies and stuff like that. So when I graduated from Loyola with my degree in marketing and stuff, I ended up in HR. Back then it was called personnel. And after my first year on the job, we were able to computerize a lot of stuff. So I had a lot more time. So I began to get people from the company to go out and talk to students at Verbum Day High School in South Central Los Angeles. Verbum Day had been started, I don't know, in the early 60s by, believe it or not, a cousin of mine, Bishop Joe Francis. Well, he was then Father Francis, but he later became a bishop and was stationed at East Orange, New Jersey. But anyhow, what I was able to do is get people from the company to go out and talk to these kids in South Central. It wasn't like one of the expensive private schools here in town. And what I wanted to do was have these kids have an opportunity to meet and talk to people that they would not normally run into in the course of their lives. My belief has always been that you can't dream about things if you don't know they exist. So I brought all sorts of people to the school: accountants, marketing guys, finance people, administrative folks, so that these kids would get a better idea of some of the things that are possible in the industry. All right, so in the course of doing this, it caught the attention of the chairman of the board, Justin himself. And we started something, this was in the late 70s. American industry was just beginning to wake up to the fact that it could play a role in politics. And there was an organization called the Business Roundtable out of New York. There's also a California Roundtable. And it's some of the major companies in both California and the United States. And what they were encouraging companies to do is create a public affairs department. And back then, what they meant by public affairs was get involved in politics, both on the local level as well as the national level. Our company, I don't want to bore you with too much.
No. This is. I mean, I know I hear the lead up, so this is good.
So, our company became one of the largest political action committees in the country at the time. This was 1979, 1980. And at one point, I think we had over $300,000, and we could provide funds to candidates for federal office up to $5,000. So
was it kind of like a political action committee?
That's exactly what it is, a political action committee. It was called DART PAC. And in the course of doing my work with public affairs, because I was running an economic education program. I'd go out and visit different plants and stuff. I ended up hiring a firm to help me with some advertising called Deaver and Hannaford. Mike Deaver and Pete Hannaford were consultants to then Governor Reagan, who was out of office. And Mike and I became fast friends. So when President Reagan was elected, there's more to this story, but when President Reagan was elected, I ran into Mike at the inaugural ball. And he said, "Look, I keep hearing your name getting tossed around for things at the Department of Commerce. You don't really want to do that, do you?" I said, "Absolutely not." Because foolishly, we just merged with Kraft Foods, And about this time, I had just got my MBA, and I thought that what I wanted to do was learn how to market cheese around the world. Uh, so at some point, I'll tell you the whole story, but
We could do a subsequent follow-up interview.
so I saw when I said to Mike, no, I don't want to go to conference, he said, great, we have a spot for you at the White House. And he walked away. And again, foolishly, I'd just seen a NBC white paper that past December. And it was not a white paper, it was a miniseries called Backstairs at the White House. And it was about the ushers at the White House. And I'm thinking to myself, does Mike want me to be an usher? Is he nuts? 2 days later, I got a call from Jim Baker telling me to come back to Washington for an interview. And I ended up accepting a position. I was offered a couple of different jobs, but I ended up accepting a job as special assistant to the president for intergovernmental affairs, which was local government. And that was my formal introduction to public service. And I got to tell you, it wasn't at all what I expected. It was a lot of work. At times, it was very thankless. But every now and then, something would happen, and you realize that what you were doing was worthwhile, and it made a difference. I remember traveling to Germany at one point, and I went to several different air bases. And the people at the base, when they realized, I was traveling with an assistant secretary of the Air Force for manpower planning. And the folks at the base were so gracious. They wanted to have big dinners at every base we went to. And they talked about how much the buildup in defense spending meant to them. It wasn't just bombs and missiles. It was improvements to the base. They talked about how it reduced lines at the stores, new equipment. It was a lifestyle change. Military life prior to the Reagan administration, that period, it was very harsh, and it was difficult. The lifestyle was truly a sacrifice. So the funds that we could provide to the military under the Reagan administration made a lot of difference to those people who were the boots, the pilots, the families of the soldiers, Marines, Navy. We lose sight of the fact frequently that the military has a lot of things behind the scenes that people don't see, not to mention their families. And if you're in Germany with your family in Germany, and you don't have and you got kids, and your wife has to scrimp and just to make ends meet when you're providing a service to the country, life's difficult, in addition to your difficult job. So it was really rewarding to see that some of the things that we did to get legislation passed made a difference.
So it must have been a big morale booster,
Yeah,
right?
it was.
For veterans and active
Well,
military.
not just veterans, for the
the active military personnel. I see.
Yeah.
So
let me just
hey, go ahead.
So what happened from there? I worked for President Reagan. I was on the president's staff for 2 years. My first year, President Reagan was shot in April. I got to the White House in February of 1981. And in April of 1981, he was shot. My job was to work with local government, mayors, county officials, city council members, towns and township peoples, city managers, and win support for the president's economic recovery program. So what I was doing was I was given an hour about every 10 days to 2 weeks with the president to meet with these local elected officials. So now the president's shot. And all of these public interest groups that I had to deal with, National League of Cities, U.S. Conference of Mayors, National Association of Counties, National Association of Towns and Townships, the City Managers Association, they all have big conventions in the summer. And my thought was, if we could bring enough people in, explain to them what we're trying to do. And remember, Dave Stockman, who was head of OMB at the time, was taking sort of a cleaver approach to budget cuts. But we had to figure out a way to negotiate and win support. So our thought was, let's get more people in to talk to the president, to express their concerns, their opinions, advice on how to go about this. And then we can figure out a way to achieve what the president wants, at the same time provide the people who are going to be affected by these budget cuts, get them involved in business that's called organizational development. So now with the president shot, and I'm told that he is not going to be able to come back to the office for the next couple of months, that threw a wrench in my plan for the upcoming summer, because you know, I don't want to go to these conventions and not have some support for what the president wants to do, because we were really changing the way federal funds were disseminated throughout the country. And it was a radical change. But we thought it was one that could be more efficient. So at 29 years old, not knowing my limits, once I found out that the president was going to be recuperating for 2 months, I called Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush and asked him if I could come talk to him. And he said, "Sure, Stever, come on up." I don't know where he got that Stever from, but he called me Stever for the rest of his life. So I went to see the vice president. Now, here's the interesting story. The role of the vice president was really without a role. And constitutionally, the only responsibilities of the vice president is to break tie votes in the Senate. Until Jimmy Carter, the vice president of the United States didn't even have an office at the White House. The vice president's office was a huge office, but it was in the Capitol, in the Senate. So I go up to see the vice president, and I explained to him what we were trying to do, what our plan had been with the president. So I said, "Mr. Vice President, would you be willing to preside in some of these meetings that I've got planned over the next 2 months, so that you can hear the concerns, suggestions, and ideas of the local government, the people that are part of my constituency? And we'll also have folks from the administration, cabinet members, who come in and talk about things that we want to do within the administration, and you'll have an opportunity to hear feedback. But the key to this whole thing will be that these people can go back to their homes and their districts and tell people they had an opportunity to voice their concerns to the Vice President of the United States. And he was actually a little flattered because that had not been the role of the Vice President. Frequently in meetings, cabinet council meetings that we would have, the Vice President would be there, but the presiding official was the president. So that caused me to be able to develop a very good relationship with the Vice President. And after the midterm elections, he asked me to join his staff as Chief Domestic Policy Advisor. And the Holy Spirit was at work because I said yes. And, you know, everything that happened in government from there on was largely due to what I learned from him and what I learned in the previous jobs. And that's one of the things that I try to also explain to our students. You know, you're not going to have your ideal job right out of school. And you're going to have to do a lot of grunt work. But all of that grunt work will culminate over time and give you a lot of experience as well as a better view of the world that you can use in God knows where. You know, when I graduated from school, Loyola University, I had no idea. I didn't even think that I'd ever be a U.S. ambassador. But again, as I said, if you always do your best, you have there's no limits. It's like Nike's old slogan, just do it. You know, just do the best you can every day. I guess you want me to talk a little bit now about the Martin Luther King holiday.
Yes, yes. I mean, I'm starting to get the picture. You're painting a very well-developed picture, a nuanced picture of what the climate was like with major budget cuts coming into play, right?
Oh, by the way, as a result, though, of the Vice President's help, that summer, we won support from the National League of Cities, U.S. Conference of Mayors, and the National League of Cities, the National League of Cities, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and the National Association of Counties. We won their support for the President's Economic Recovery Plan. And, you know, so, but it was, again, listening, and we found out what kinds of things we could do, where we could make cuts, and what kinds of programs we need to hold harmless. All right, so joining the Vice President's staff was really interesting. I was a member of the senior staff and would attend the senior staff briefings and from time to time. And I also had access to the national security briefings. But it caused me to work very closely with the Vice President of the United States. And he was a lot different than President Reagan, President Reagan was really a gracious guy. And he was very thoughtful. The Washington Post talked about him like he was the village idiot. But this man really knew what he wanted to accomplish. And in cabinet meetings, for instance, if, you know, so you'd have these secretaries of different departments that come in and they're doing these slides and graphs with things that they want to do. And at the end of their presentation, the president would ask them, well, what does this do in terms of increasing employment? How does it reduce inflation? How does it stabilize the money supply? And if you couldn't give him an answer for that, he would say, well, I think you need to do a little bit more work and need to send him back. Bush, I got to tell you, was an incredible guy. I used to think that I had contacts on the Hill and I knew what was going on. And inevitably I'd call him or I'd go over to his office and say, hey, let me tell you what's going on. And he would just about finish my sentence because he was already on top of this. What happened over time was we built really a tremendous working relationship. And it was probably the best boss, well, not probably, it was the best boss I ever had. But Sunday mornings, I would get a call at 7 and the phone would ring. This was before cell phones. And the White House switchboard would pick up and said, Mr. Rhodes, White House switchboard. I have the Vice President of the United States. And the Vice President would pick up and he'd say, Stever, we want you over at the house at 8 this morning. We're going to go running and so on. So the relationship we had was more than just supporting the president in what the president wanted to accomplish. There really was a genuine feeling that you were part of this family. I'd gone through a divorce, and Mrs. Bush thought that she was my mother and wanted to see who I was dating. And anyhow, so we were on a trip. And when we came back, landed at Andrews Air Force Base, one of the little airmen gave me a note telling me that Lee Atwater wanted to see me as soon as I got back to the White House. And this was probably 7 at night. And I say night because this was in November, 1983. So I get back to the White House and Lee is in my office and he says, listen, buddy, it's on you now. You got past me. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, the working group has met. At this point, the House and the Senate had voted in favor of a holiday in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King. The working group is pretty standard in the executive branch. Whenever there's legislation on the Hill, there are departments and agencies, the departments and agencies that are affected by the legislation track it with the White House. And the goal here is for the White House and the departments and agencies to work with the Congress to fashion the bill in some way that would be acceptable to the president, so that when the bill arrives at the White House, it's something that the president will sign. So the working group in this case was a large working group because a holiday affects every department and agency. So there is a financial impact. So Lee tells me that the working group voted to have the president veto the Martin Luther King bill. And he said, look, I was kind of by myself. Most people, I shouldn't say most, a lot of people thought that Lee Atwater, because he was from the South Carolina, they thought of him as a racist. Lee and I used to run every day after work, and we were buddies. Now, he also was the master of dirty tricks in politics, but he played.
Doesn't necessarily make him racist, right?
Right. He played guitar for James Brown, Sam and Dave, Joe Tex. So anyhow, so that's the way I was greeted when I got back to the White House. And I'm thinking to myself, God, what can I do now? This is, first off, it was unbelievable to me that the working group would take this position. But in all administrations, you have people who are on the extremes politically in terms of what their administration stands for. So I was really troubled that night. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do. But somehow or another, I knew that I couldn't let the president veto this bill. So the next morning, the national security briefing then was at 7:30 in the morning. So about 6:45, I was in the vice president's office, sitting there going through the papers and stuff and waiting for him to arrive. So when he walked in, he said, "Well, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, Mr. Bush, I want to tell you that I'm going to have to resign." And he looked at me kind of strange and said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "The working group that's been following the Martin Luther King holiday bill voted yesterday to have the president, their recommendation to the president was that he veto the bill." And I said, we've been on the wrong side of affirmative action because people used to confuse affirmative action with quotas at the White House. And I said, we've been on the wrong side of voting rights. And if the president vetoes this bill, he's going to go down in history as a racist. I mean, this bill has passed both the House and Senate almost unanimously. And the votes that were not in favor were because people weren't there or abstained. I said, this is the first time in the history of the new world that we have an opportunity to honor a man who's brought about significant change, social change in America, and done it in a peaceful way. This is essentially what we're supposed to stand for. We're the party of Lincoln. So he said, okay, come on, let's go to the briefing. So we go to the national security briefing. And as we leave, he says, don't go back to the office, come with me. And he said, let's go see Mike. Now, remember, I told you, Mike Deaver was the reason I was there to begin with. So we go, we walk up the stairs from the situation room, and we go to Deaver's office, Mike Deaver, a wonderful guy. And he says, tell Mike what you told me. So I go through the same story, but we've been on the wrong side. First time in the history of the new world, we have a Black man who brought about significant change in our country in a nonviolent fashion. If we don't celebrate his holiday, then the president is going to go down in history as a racist. So at that point, now this is where credibility comes in. I'd worked there now a little over 2 years. I'm in my third year. So after I said this to Mike, he reaches behind him and he opens a door, and the door goes into the Oval Office. And as he opens the door, the Vice President of the United States, Mike Deaver, and I look at the president. He looks at us. So he says, come on in. So as we walk into the office, we ended up positioning ourselves in front of the president, who's sitting at his desk. Steve Rhodes is in the center. George Herbert Walker Bush is on one side, and Michael K. Deaver on the other. And Mike says, tell the president what you told me. And I go through the same story. There's a few little things I can tell you about that, but I won't. We'll do that another time. Okay. So I explained to the president, I tell him the same thing, and he looks up at me, and I said, Mr. President, you have to really sign this bill. I just want you to know we're circumventing the system here, because you're going to get something from the working group had we not had this meeting suggesting that you veto this bill, but I think that's not in your best interest, nor in the best interest of the country. And he says, well, Steve, I'll sign it. And Mike immediately turns to me and says, okay, and you're the action officer. And I said, Mike, I can't be the action officer. I'm an assistant to the vice president. This said, I think Libby Dole was in charge of outreach. But anyhow, this is the first time in the history of the White House that an assistant to the vice president became the action officer on an event involving the president. It was our job to coordinate the event, send out the invitations. And 72 hours later, for the first time in the history of the White House, we had a bill signing in the Oval Office with 600 people. And that's what happened. And I think you've seen one of those pictures from the signing.
I have. I saw the newspaper article too. Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing, Steve. That's just really such an amazing story. It teaches so many different aspects of everything you're teaching your students in the class, but then working across differences, right? Like learning how to do that. I mean, we need to learn how to do that again. Gosh.
Well, on one trip to Northern Europe, when I was on the vice president's staff, typically when presidents travel, you see the press corps with them. And the press corps is in a separate plane usually. And it's sometimes referred to as the zoo plane. So the press plane will land before the Air Force One or Air Force Two, so that they can begin to get pictures as the president or vice president gets off the plane. And as there are press conferences in the course of a trip, the press corps is there. So we were in Great Britain, and this is when the president wanted the vice president to talk to heads of state in Northern Europe to talk about locating cruise missiles. And we were having a press conference in London with Margaret Thatcher. And one of the, I remember this like it was yesterday, one of the reporters, after the vice president and Mrs. Thatcher gave their remarks, one person asked the question of Mrs. Thatcher, and the question was, Mrs. Thatcher, what do you think about the nickname that you've been given, the Iron Lady? And this woman looked at this reporter with steely eyes, like I had only seen by Sister Mary Lucy when I was in 8th grade. And she said to this reporter, what good are ideals and morals if you aren't willing to fight for them? And that's kind of what I want our students to feel. Every now and then you have to do something uncomfortable because it's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And I was putting a lot on the line by telling the vice president that I was going to resign. Mm-hmm. But I thought it was the right thing to do. So if you dare greatly, you can achieve great things. Mr. Reagan used to have a little plaque, this credenza behind his desk that said, there's no limit to what you can achieve if you don't worry about who gets credit. Mm-hmm. And that's the truth. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. How we do,
Ambassador? Yeah, this is I think that this might be a really good place to end this conversation for now. I'm going to work on this a little bit and I'll send you the link once I post it up, and then maybe we can get it on the NCRP website and the Facebook page. If you want to look at it first, I think this has been a fantastic conversation, really, and very educational, and it's going to help me write up what I need to write up about this history of yours and your contribution. So is there anything else you'd like to say?
If you have any questions about what we've discussed and you want more information, just give me a buzz. I'm at your beck and call.
Thank you, Steve. It's been great. I'm going to stop recording now and